Hello, everyone. This is Susan. Welcome to the Peacebuilding Podcast, where we track down as many of the most interesting people as we can find around the planet who are intervening in creative and sometimes outrageous ways to bring people together to build peace on the planet, whether that's what they're intending to do or not. We got a little slowed down on getting out this episode. I'm working with my sound guy, Scott, who is an incredible help and has his finger on the pulse of younger listeners. So we've been trying to mix it up, thinking about ways we can make the podcast as magnetic as possible and, have a goal of seeing if we can get 10,000 listeners, both serving people that are actually in the peace building field, but people who know nothing about it and just want to hear some really cool stories about how people are working out in the world in really constructive ways, in contrast to what we hear on the media. So let me see, just some updates on me. I went to a play recently called Oslo. Pretty interesting. Check it out. I don't know if you get an opportunity to do that, but it's about a back channel process orchestrated by a Norwegian diplomat and her husband to bring together Yasser Arafat, who was the Palestinian leader at the time, and Shimon Peres, who was the Israeli leader at the time. It's a pretty interesting play. Just it does a good job of showing how the formal diplomatic structures can get in the way of creating real dialogue, and just really how kind of antiquated that whole system is, because there's so much new process ideas out there of ways to bring people together. A lot of what we're talking about on the Peacebuilding Podcast that really could be incorporated at lots of different levels of a system, the higher up level, which is where usually those dialogues happen, but all the way through the system in ways that could create an entirely different climate of conversation and dialogue. So anyway, that's always something that interests me, is how can we actually up-level what we're doing in the field of international relations. I'm headed to China, to Shanghai, in a week to deliver a speech at the International Elite Women's Summit there. This is the fourth time they've held this summit, and I'm going to be speaking to 1,000 women. And the theme of the conference is more courage, more strength. And my particular focus is the title of my speech is going to be Igniting Women, the Pathway to Planetary Peace, a topic that I'm super stoked about. In all the thinking about the different ways that we can intervene to build common ground, to build peace on the planet. I basically think that empowering women across the board, across the planet, from the family system right up to the global level, is going to bring the biggest shift and the change that we need. So stay tuned for that. If I like what I do, I will definitely broadcast it on the podcast. My guest on the show today is someone I go way back with, actually to the beginning of my career in working in negotiation and conflict resolution. His name is Dean Foster, and his name is kind of synonymous with intercultural training and consulting. He's worked in about 100 countries, teaching people about cultural differences and cross-cultural communication, and has been a speaker and lecturer all over the place. So you might want to check out his impressive bio on the website. Dean and I got started together long ago, training people in intercultural negotiations, and then he kind of veered off and majored in culture and minored in negotiation, and I did the opposite. I continued to focus on negotiation, blending culture into it. He was a super smart one. He built up his business and then sold it to Berlitz for a nice, handsome sum, and then continued in the biz. So go, Dean. I caught up with him somewhere between a trip of his to Prague and New York, and liked this quote early on, something like, when faced with something we don't understand or that we find mystifying, we always have a choice. We can decide to approach this as an opportunity for growth and learning, a positive approach to working with this issue, or we can approach it fearfully, something that, as something that's dangerous to us. So Dean's going to talk about that and his experience. He's also going to talk about in the entire time that he's been doing this, he's really seen this shift of globalization over the last 25, 30 years. I remember when we actually started in this biz, and people were saying inside companies, there's no need for cross-cultural understanding. We really have a global culture, a global multinational culture now that transcends any individual culture. I just don't think that ever really has been the case, although there's some truth to it for sure. Dean says what's interesting is that he sees in the millennial generation a greater acceptance that cultural differences exist, but not necessarily a real increase yet in understanding about what those differences are. So I tried in this interview to get Dean to put himself in the center of the universe, his universe, which is Brooklyn, New York, and then give us a sense of how different cultures, like how a middle-aged guy from China might perceive him, how somebody from Russia might perceive him. We sort of did a little bit of that. It didn't quite work, but it always is interesting to just get a sense that how you're perceived, of course, has everything to do with who's doing the looking and will be perceived differently all over the world by lots of different people. So Dean's going to talk about some projects he did supporting an American multinational working with a Russian team. That's going to be the biggest story he tells, a bit about China, talking about multicultural teams, because that's the way so much business is done these days. So hope you're able to give it a listen. Hope you enjoy the episode. Please, as always, give me some feedback directly to Susan@thepeacebuildingpodcast.com. We are working on our Facebook page so that we can have more of a dialogue there. And thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. So, Dean, it's great to have you. You and I go way back. And we haven't talked too much over the last number of years, but you've had an amazing journey. You've worked in 100 countries around the world. And I think I wanted to start the conversation today with you just reflecting on yourself as a little kid and maybe, retrace your footsteps. Obviously, the highlights of kind of what got you to where you are today? Like, what planted the seeds in you to end up doing this kind of work, this intercultural work all over the planet? You game to give a little shot at that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Susan. Thanks for asking, because it gives me an opportunity to reflect a little bit, going way, way back. And I guess I could be simplistic and just start by saying I was really bad at math when I was a kid, and I knew that wasn't my strong suit. But I was interested in the sciences. And so how am I going to put that together? Well, I could go to social sciences, right? Or I could go into the arts, and I did that a little bit in my life as well. But I think in combination with the interest in social sciences was this opportunity that I had, luckily. I mean, I grew up in multicultural Brooklyn, New York, where we lived in an apartment house with people from all over the world.
A very multicultural place, Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is part of New York City. I'm just saying that because some people may not know. And how many cultures do you? I know, like in Queens, another part of New York City, it's ridiculous. It's like 15 cultures. How many do you think are in Brooklyn?
Oh, I can't imagine. I mean, it's the whole world.
Yeah.
And even when I was growing up as a kid, the nature of that demographic changed, of course. At the time, in the apartment house where I grew up, there were, Italians and Jews and blacks and Hispanics. And I'm sure the numbers and the percentages, if you looked at it today, would be different, but it would still be an incredible mix of people from all over the world. And I grew up with this. I remember spending holidays that I didn't know anything about when I was a small child, simply by going down the hall and going into my friend's house, and I could see how they were celebrating something that was a mystery to me. And I guess, that was one of the first really formative experiences, and it goes back into my DNA almost, because what I learned, I think, was that something that is different and maybe mysterious is really all about a lot of fun. It's not something necessarily to be frightened of. It's not something to be fearful of. In fact, something that enriches your life. I mean, I always felt like going into my friend Russ's house, who was in a Roman Catholic battalion, and celebrating midnight mass with him was mysterious and unusual, but a lot of fun. And so maybe it gave me an outlook toward looking at cultural differences. Not only was it interesting, but it also was something to be embraced and possibly understood, but always approached with a certain openness and positiveness that was the opposite, I think, of what we experience when we deal with cultural differences today on a professional level.
Were there ever moments that you remember feeling afraid?
Never afraid. No. Never fearful. Sometimes lost, I think. Sometimes not understanding. But I think that's precisely the issue, that when faced with something that we don't understand or that we find mystifying, we have a choice. We can decide to approach this as an opportunity for growth, learning, experience, enrichment, a positive approach to working with this issue, or we can approach it fearfully. We can approach it feeling that it's something that's dangerous. And I think in the professional work that I've come to do over the last 25 years, it's really been all about helping people approach the issue of cultural difference from a positive perspective as opposed to a fearful one.
Hey, Dean, how does it feel like when you scan from your childhood to now, all your travels, how do you feel? What's your broad brush, observation about how the world has changed with respect to, I guess, cultural integration or cultural awareness, or, what do you see as sort of the big themes that have happened?
Well, I mean, certainly globalization, and by that we mean all of the forces that have been going on for the last 25, 30 years, has increased an awareness of cultural differences, right? So, if you take a look at the millennial generation, for example, I mean, they are much more aware of the fact that cultural differences exist. We used to have to struggle in our work in just getting people to acknowledge the fact that cultural differences were really an issue, that they existed, they were on the table, that it was something you needed to work with. Today, I don't think we have to do that so much because people have traveled all over, and there's been a greater opportunity for people to come in contact with cultural difference. And I think, this is a good news, bad news issue. Because there's been much more cultural contact through media, through transportation, through travel, etc. But that doesn't mean, and I think this is the danger, it doesn't mean that there's any more understanding. There's a greater awareness that it's an issue that's on the table, but what I do about it, how I react to it, how I manage it, has not really changed. That still requires a lot of understanding and a lot of work. And I think that we have to be very sensitive to this difference, because there's a tendency to assume that either the world has homogenized in some sort of global place where we can, in fact, work with each other despite cultural differences. That's a dangerous position to take, I think, because the cultural differences are profound. They will always be there. Globalization has not eliminated them. If anything, it's only highlighted them, I think. And simply being aware that they're there, but still not knowing what to do about them, that's a tricky place to be.
I always, have said about culture, that culture is to a group what personality is to an individual. And it's kind of like, a group personality, if you will. And I know that for myself, one of the reasons I spent a good bit of time in Latin America and learned Spanish, and I think that was intentional for a number of reasons, in that I come from a British American background, and Latin culture really was a great kind of counterbalance. It kind of opened up a lot of other ways of seeing the world, a more emotional way of seeing the world. A lot of things about that. Also, a less sense of entitled way of seeing the world. How has, you've really been around the world a lot, and how have you, and you've been thinking about culture. How do you feel like, have you changed as a cultural being? Have you expanded? I don't know, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I'm still the kid from Brooklyn.
Well, that's an intercultural person, That's
what I mean by that is I think I've become in many ways more authentic to myself. I've learned through all of these experiences that you have to be yourself. And so in a sense, I've become more of who I always was. But I've done so, I think, with an understanding, hopefully, of what it means to be me to the other person who's not me. And by that I mean who I am, I understand now, has a certain meaning to someone else who is not me. And I hopefully understand what that meaning is so that I can help.
Wait, can you say that? I didn't quite get that. Say that again.
Yeah. I'm still me,
yeah, okay.
And maybe I'm more me than I ever was, actually, hopefully. But I'm me with an understanding
of who me is. I see.
Of who me is, and an understanding of what the other person perceives me to be.
Yeah.
So that we can build some common ground. If I know how you're seeing me, and if I understand you because I've learned about your culture, it doesn't mean I have to be less of who I am. In fact, I can be even more of who I am when we can build some common ground around the fact that I know how you're perceiving me. I know why you're making the judgments you're making about me. And I understand your culture, so I'm going to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And it just helps us build some common ground a whole lot faster. So
let me ask you something, Dean. That's interesting. We are going to get into some stereotypes here, but how do you think you, is perceived by, like, say, a Chinese, I don't know, like sort of maybe a cultural norm person from China? Can we say that? Can we ask that question?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. We do go into stereotypes when you talk about culture, and I like to distinguish stereotypes from generalizations, right? Valid generalizations are based on scientific study. Social scientific analysis tells us that under certain circumstances, most Chinese, or certain population of Chinese, if you control for the different factors, are going to tend to behave a certain way when encountering a U.S. American from Brooklyn, New York. And I think we can make some valid statements about what the Chinese perception might be, just as we can make some valid statements about what a U.S. American might tend to do when encountering the Chinese for the first time. If we understand what those generalizations might be, and hopefully they are valid and backed up by social scientific research, then we can approach each other and get beyond them, I think, a little faster and actually have fun with them.
So could you do something, could you do a little game for us here? And could you put yourself in the center of the world and just, like, briefly kind of go around, hit some countries around the world, and tell me how you might be seen differently, purely from a generality? I know we're making generalizations, but how might you be seen differently?
Well, I think people are going to start with their own built-in stereotypes about U.S. Americans. So the first thing I try to do, because I believe that people are probably going to do that without any information to the contrary. I have to assume that they don't know anything about me, and therefore they are going to generalize or maybe even stereotype. So my first approach is to support whatever positive assumptions they have about me while doing everything I can to dismiss the negative assumptions. So if I know, for example, that I'm going to be perceived in continental Europe as a loud, over-the-top American who's come here to tell us what to do and doesn't understand how we do things here, if that's the initial stereotype that I think I might expect, then I have to do everything I can to undermine that expectation and be someone who indicates otherwise, that I'm here to listen, not to tell, that I'm here to understand how you do things before I make suggestions about how I'd like to do, how I think things should be done. And once I kind of disempower the stereotype by my own behavior, then we can get on with really discovering who we each are.
Can you go around the world and do exactly what you just did with Europe? Can you give those kind of prejudgments that might occur towards you? I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't want to even do this, but it's kind of interesting to see just how the world might perceive a white guy from Brooklyn, American guy from Brooklyn. Any other circling the globe kind of things that you could say?
Well, I think, from my own experiences, let's take a look at Japan, for example. Because of Japanese culture and because of the interaction of Japanese culture and U.S. American culture and all of the media and politics around that goes on between every culture, one of the impressions that one of the perceptions that I think I receive until I undermine them, until I actively discount them for the individual, is the fact that I could never really understand who they are, that I'm always going to be the gaijin on the outside who needs to be handled and controlled in a kind of arm's length way. And so what I want to do is actively work toward indicating to my Japanese colleagues that I do understand their culture to probably a greater degree than most U.S. Americans, and that I want to have a relationship that is not at arm's length, and I want to invite them to tell me more about who they are, so that we can get to a more honest place. So the expectation, for example, in Japan, to your question, is that I need to be treated at arm's length, and I can't really have a closer relationship than that. Mm-hmm. And so I want to actively work to undermine that expectation.
Dean, what is the most foreign? What has felt the most foreign culture or intercultural experience that you have had?
Well, on a professional level, working interculturally, I think one of the most foreign, meaning something that I had difficulty wrapping my head and arms around, and I would say heart as well. It was my mother's father's culture, which is Russia. Mm-hmm. I've had I think my greatest professional challenges have been to work with Russians. They provided me with the biggest challenge to understanding and to emotionally allowing them to be who they are and still positively respond, productively respond to them. I found it difficult for me to do that. I don't think it's a function of difference. It's not that they are that much more different, because I've certainly worked with cultures that are significantly more different from my culture. But it's it's the content of the differences, not the degree of differences. And the differences that I encountered working professionally with Russians challenged me to come up with productive responses. And that was hard.
Could you dig into that a little bit? I mean, I'm curious, like, was that, could you tell us more about what happened? I'm interested in getting into some stories maybe, and maybe we could just get into a story there, or any story that you want to get into. But I am left with wondering about the Russia example. Is that because of your personal psychology, or because it's your mother's father, it was your grandfather, and who knows how that influenced you and why that, whatever, or is it something to do with your cultural norms and sort of some of the general cultural norms in Russia?
Yeah. It was about cultural norm differences. I try to separate the psychology piece out of it. I think I've been a fairly reflective fellow, and I think I actively try not to bring that piece to the process. I want to stay objective whenever I can. Building a personal relationship with someone is a little bit different. But working with the Russians, for example, was challenging because of the normative differences. My expectation was
first let me back up for a second. When you say you worked with the Russians, what were you doing? Can you set it up for us a little bit? What was the situation?
Right. I was working with a U.S. company in Moscow, and they were negotiating terms of an agreement. This was a business deal. And I was working with individuals also who were having difficulty working with their Russian counterparts over getting agreement around certain terms, as well as being able to enforce those agreements, and making sure that they could follow through and rely on those agreements. And ultimately, Susan, it came down to the fact that no matter what we negotiated, no matter what we agreed to, things would always be unreliable, and that what was said was being interpreted by the Western side as untrue and untrustworthy. I think there was a significant issue of trust that never was established. And it was very difficult for the Western team to establish that level of trust.
And why, Dean, you and I know a lot about building trust in groups. What happened? What do you think got in the way of there being that kind of trust that would create something where the agreement was much more reliable, and to use your words, or something that people would follow through on?
I was always working at a level that wasn't at the level that needed to be worked at.
Yeah, such an issue, right? It's like, ugh. And how was that influencing what was going on? So you were trying to do the work at such and such a level, but up above you, there was stuff going on that was undermining the trust that you needed? Precisely. And that this was the case with every individual involved in the negotiation that at least I had contact with. And ultimately, in Russian culture, and I think it's even more true today than it was then when I was doing this, and I think historically it's always been the case, the ones that you needed to have that trustworthy relationship built with in order to be able to rely on everything else that everyone else said was a very, very small handful of invisible people that I certainly did not have any contact with, nor did any of the Western team. And I've been so frustrated about this myself. And, like sometimes coming in and working an issue, like people will identify, I'm often working with, conflict and coaching, and people will identify the issue at one layer in the system. And I will always try and go as high up into the system as I can, but often I will get blocked at a certain point. And even though I know that what's going on up above that is really influencing what's happening, but I can't, sometimes you can't get there.
That's right. And if you're not talking to the people that you need to have need to be talking to, and certainly in the case of Russia, that you need to have these very intense, personal, trustworthy relationships with. Everything else is very unreliable. And what makes it even more complicated, at least in my experience working with Russians, is that all indications up until you make this realization and up until you realize what's really happening, is that the relationship can be done according to Western norms, that the negotiation can go forward based on Western norms, until you realize that that's not the case, and that it is the reality is completely different from what I started with.
Sorry, Dean, when you say can be done according to Western norms, what are you saying exactly?
That there's a reliability, that there's an implicit trust, that when we say yes, we mean yes, that when we have an agreement, we have an agreement, that we can expect to go forward based on Tuesday what we agreed to on Monday. In
other words, I would say there's a contractual view. You can enter into a contract, you can negotiate, you can sign, and that will be something that you implement, versus a different kind of worldview that you really will implement around a relationship that you've built of trust, and that contracts are not that meaningful.
Right, and that's a broad theme in many, many cultures. I think the particular challenge with Russia, I mean, for example, in China, we know that's an issue. In many other cultures, that's an issue, where implementation is based on relationship as opposed to contract, and that's okay. But therefore, access to the people with whom one needs to have the relationship, and the ability to build that relationship with those key individuals in those cultures becomes critical. The challenge I had with Russia was that access to those individuals was very, very difficult.
Right.
While in many other cultures where these kinds of trustworthy relationships are critical, there are avenues for building those relationships. There are ways to do so. And one of the things that challenged me with the Russians is that the way to build those relationships in Russia were simply unacceptable to me and to many of my Western colleagues.
Like what?
It involved things we couldn't do.
Like a lot of drinking? Or what?
No, that would have been the easy part.
Okay.
No, ultimately it meant the company had to make a decision as to whether or not they wanted to participate in graft.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And
that's usually the line that we can't cross.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And that was the only access to those individuals we needed to have those trustworthy relationships with.
Yeah. So I'm at a point of like, oh, could I dig down deeper there, or I don't know if you want to tell me what exactly they wanted from you, but partially I'm thinking maybe we should go to a different story and hear a different culture and a different place where, unless you want to fill out that story any more than that.
Well, the frustration for us is that everything fell apart. It didn't work out.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out because they couldn't cross that line.
Yeah.
And I think had there been an awareness right at the beginning, and these were lessons learned by me too, right? Because I'll talk about Russia differently today based on these experiences. And I'll advise people based differently than what I did then.
But Dean, sorry to interrupt you. Is it Russia, or is it just the issue of corruption that is so rampant around the planet?
Well, that's it. I mean, I think it is an issue of corruption, essentially. And to what degree is that more prevalent in certain cultures? To what degree does a culture support that kind of approach to business and to life? Is a question. I think if you go into a place like Russia, you want to know that this is an issue that needs to be managed. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how you want to manage it is a decision you need to make right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, is it any more prevalent there than it is elsewhere? I don't know. Is it more ultimately determinant of how things work? I would say yes. So knowing that, you have to have a different kind of strategy.
I know in Afghanistan, because, I don't know if you know, I was there working with the women leaders in the government, and for them, this is just the biggest issue. I mean, just because I think those women have huge integrity, and they're looking at a system around them that is very corrupt, like very, very corrupt, and it's affecting everything. And yeah.
Right. And I think, Susan, you're raising a really important point, which is that culture is a piece of the issue when working with other countries. It's not the only issue, because the political and the economic and the social issues can be profound. So if we're dealing with a failed state, if we're dealing with a government that's highly corrupt, maybe that's a bigger issue than managing the cultural differences. However, as a culturalist, I like to look at that question and see, okay, what is the bigger issue when I'm working in a particular country? And why do we have economic and social and political systems that are more or less problematic, more or less corrupt, more or less difficult to work with? And when I ask the question why, then I think we can look to culture to get some answers.
Could you give us oh, go ahead. I wanted to have you give us a story about that, but go ahead.
Sure. I mean, if you look at it, and typically you need to look at history. If you look at Afghan history, if you look at Russian history, for example, going back to my experience there as a culture that was a challenge for me to work with, the expectation for having to manage issues of corruption and or failed states should be high. Because we should expect it, because the history tells us that we don't have traditions in those cultures that support the norms that we're expecting.
We being the Western United, or the U.S. or the West, or who's we?
Yes, we being me. In this case, me and the Western organization that I represented, for example, in my work with Russia. If we had gone in with that understanding, a deeper understanding of that, we should have been able to expect this kind of government and political issue, which is not a cultural issue per se, but it is a major issue and a source of frustration.
Mm-hmm. So, Dean, maybe we could shift to an example or get into how cultural understanding has, in what ways bringing cultural understanding has really facilitated people coming together. Any stories like that?
Yeah. In a lot of my work today, we're working with global teams. Maybe 20 people in different locations that have never worked with each other, never met with each other, but are now working with each other virtually every day, and who may or may not have received any kind of formal training or understanding about cultural difference. And now they're having to work with people on their team, 19 other individuals who may think differently, may solve problems in different ways, may have different expectations about the degree of trust that they should have with each other before they can accomplish their task, may have different ways of approaching the accomplishment of a task. And so the first thing we have to do with these teams, and we want to take them through a 3-step process.
Let me just ask you first: so are these teams? How are they interfacing? Are they interfacing through video? Are they interfacing through email? Are they coming together? When I know you're going to get into your 3-step process, but how are they seeing each other or communicating?
Well, in my experience, most of them are communicating virtually via email every day.
Yeah.
Right? They're working with each other on a particular global project.
Right.
And so it's mainly email, occasional video conference, and maybe very occasionally the opportunity to see each other face to face at some sort of periodic quarterly or once a year meeting.
And is it fair to say? Is it fair to say that email is just such a interface that's so fraught for cultural misunderstanding? I don't know. I mean, I think it's fraught for misunderstanding, period. But you add the element of culture, and you're really asking for trouble, possibly. But
Yeah, and I think, with culture, the story is always it cuts both ways. I think in many ways we have an opportunity with email.
Okay.
If everyone understands that the word means the word, and that anything that's not in the email is not intended, then we can get some clarity pretty quickly. But we have to get everybody to understand that that's what we're using the email for. I think if we're using a form of global English, for example, email is not a bad way to overcome language barriers, because it does allow people to sit and read and analyze, as opposed to immediately respond to a voice in a language that they may not understand well. So it allows for a certain analysis and deliberation that I think is important to overcome language barriers. But you're absolutely right, Susan. It cuts the other way, too. And in cultures where most information is embedded in a contextual understanding, as opposed to in the words that are used, email is probably a terrible way to communicate, because it's only words and there's very little context, except for the occasional emojis that we want to throw in there. So if we get the team to understand this issue around just emailing, for example, that there are some of you who are probably not going to say as much as others need to have said in order to be sure that we're understanding each other and confirming the understanding that we have with each other. If we can just get that on the table and recognize that as a fact, that's step one. Understanding that there are cultural issues that need to be looked at and that have an effect even on things as simple as how we email each other every day. So for us in our work, that the first thing to do is create awareness to the fact that culture is on the table, and analyze where it affects our day-to-day work with each other.
And Dean, how do you describe what culture is to these folks? What do you even say it is? Do you like my definition that I gave earlier, or do you the culture is to a group what personality is to an individual, or like a group personality, or what do you say?
No, I like that. I do. I wrote it down, Susan.
Oh, good. Good. Glad to be of service.
Yeah, I think when we talk in this first stage of getting people aware of cultural differences, the best way to do it is to get them to tell their stories about how they've had cultural experiences that they didn't understand and how they reacted to it, and to see themselves first. Before we can explore, quote unquote, the other, we need to explore ourselves and recognize that we are ourselves cultural beings, and that the way we behave can be very, very different and mystifying to others, and that it's a way of behaving that has been defined by other forces, not just our personality, but the culture in which we've grown up.
And we know that, I'm
and that
sure
it gives us a set.
You've heard the saying, the fish is the last one to know that it's swimming in water. When you ask this question, do people even know what to say? Because are they aware that they are cultural beings, or in how it might have influenced them?
More today than before, but not deeply. And that goes back to what I referred to earlier. I think there is a higher awareness of the fact that the fish can live in different ponds, and that there are other ponds out there in which different fish are living. But the knowledge of what those ponds are, actually, and what those differences are, drilling down beyond just awareness, is something that still is severely lacking. So
could you say
that's
more? Say more about that. Like how does it show up? And
yeah, well, I know that someone if I'm in Kuwait and I'm speaking to someone in Brazil, I know that the person in Brazil may have a different way of thinking about things. But what those differences are, I do not know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still the issue that's on the table. So I think globalization has given us a higher level of awareness than 30 years ago, where people denied the fact that cultural differences either existed or had an impact. Now there's a level of acceptance that they do exist and that there's some impact, but how it impacts us and what do I do about it, that's still very much not there.
Dean, let me stop you on that. Sorry, I know I keep intervening here, but I know in this conversation that sometimes there is that point of view of like, oh, cultural differences are irrelevant. We're globalizing, like everybody speaks English, which isn't true. We don't really need to understand this. But now you're saying something different. You're saying that maybe there is more acceptance that in fact cultural differences are real, and that in fact it really does behoove us to understand it better.
Well, I think I agree with your first statement, the former and not the latter. I'm not sure people are recognizing that the cultural differences have that much of an impact, and I think we're at a dangerous point actually in this issue right now, because there is this masking of cultural differences. Globalization masks cultural differences, and I think it creates a perception that, well, we're all kind of becoming the same anyway. And I think on a superficial level, very superficial level, that's probably true. If you're in the global business world, for example, and you're stepping off of planes, one day you step off a plane in Sao Paulo, and then you go to a meeting in Tokyo, and then you go to a meeting in Sydney, Australia. At a superficial level, there has been the development of a certain similarity. So we're all using some form of global English probably, and in this kind of a context, in a global business environment. We're all using technology. The office that we walk into is probably similar to the office that we left. And there may be certain practices in business that have become more universal. But this is a very thin level and a very superficial level. Once we get beyond this, the cultural differences that are more fundamental are profound and have remained profound. And I think globalization, in fact, has made the deeper cultural differences more visible and more of an issue, as it has simultaneously created a very superficial level of similarity around the world.
Could you give some examples of the how did you word it, the deeper cultural issues, not the superficial stuff, but the deeper stuff?
Yeah, the deeper, the iceberg model of culture has traditionally been talked about and used. What
is that? Yeah, tell us what that is.
Yeah, what we're saying is that the things that you perceive through your five senses is the tip of the iceberg, and that's the smallest part of culture. It's the most visible. You can hear it, taste it, smell it. You step off a plane, you see differences or similarities, but it's all through your perceptions. The deeper part of culture is the part of the iceberg that's under the surface, and you don't see it. And that's much more important, because these are the values and the beliefs and the orientations that people have, expectations about how life is supposed to go. This is, if you don't understand this, you're not perceiving it. You don't see my values when you see my behaviors. You only see my behaviors, but my behaviors are a reflection of those much more fundamental, deeper values. Until I explain my values to you, or until my values become explained to you by someone, you don't understand them, and they may represent profoundly different ways of experiencing the world.
Could you give an example?
So I think, this expectation that we were talking about before, for example, about the degree to which I need to build trust before I can actually feel comfortable about working with you. I think your experience, Susan, in Latin America probably showed you that there is a high need for the Latin American version of this would be referred to as simpatico, right? Where we need to really have a sense of trust and confidence in each other in order to move forward with making decisions and solving problems. But in other cultures, it works the other way around, certainly in the business world, where we first do the job, take care of the transaction, and by virtue of the success of the transaction, then we have trust with each other. So knowing that this difference exists and understanding that this is a difference around values and expectations of how the world is supposed to work, we can extrapolate, therefore, certain kinds of business behaviors that we should expect. And we can understand those different business behaviors if we understand these fundamental value differences.
Let me ask you something about that, because my experience from working globally is that building relationships is still much more the norm than the kind of contract view of getting things done. Like there's many, many more cultures in the world that really prefer to build a strong relationship and then through that get the job done versus, write the contract, do the agreement, and then build the relationship through that. Is that your experience as well, or do you think that's not true?
No, you're absolutely right. And to your point, that is precisely why I say that fundamentally, globalization has not really affected the fundamentals of cultures. Most cultures prefer to work that way.
Yeah.
That's the value system. And after 30 years of globalization, that's still the case.
Yeah.
And yet from the Western business perspective, the expectation is, well, geez, after 30 years, haven't these folks gotten it?
Can't we get on with this? Write the contract for Christ's sake and get the thing done,
And so we're living at a time where the expectation for this kind of change is there, but the reality is not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that only heightens the frustration that we see when these two examples of, just using this as an example, these two cultural differences come together.
So I want to, if we could, as you know, this podcast is really about building common ground in groups. It's about building peace. And, I'd love to get into some of your reflections about whether cultural, we're skirting around it, whether cultural competence is critical to bringing people together. Can you bring a group together and not have cultural competence? Is that possible?
I think that you can. Yeah, I think you can bring a group together and still not have the participants at a level of cultural competence that is, let's say, desirable. I think the more fundamental issue is finding common ground, and how we do that, I think, practically does involve culture most of the time, but it doesn't have to. If the focus is really building common ground, and there are cultural differences at the table, what we want to do is use those cultural differences to help build common ground, as opposed to allowing them to become problems and distractions and boulders that are in the way of building common ground.
Of course, I can't help but think about gender because, it's people don't think of it as a cultural difference often, but it is set. I was on the interview with Rabia Roberts. She does a lot of work around the world with her husband, and she was talking about how much they would go into a place like Myanmar. And really, it was so important for both of them to be seeing, because they were seeing things very differently. And the seeing was based on gender. It's like they just had a different worldview, a different set of experiences, so they would understand things differently. And my experience is that it's true around the world, that men and women have just had a different cultural, of course, we're different culturally by nationality, but that issue of gender is huge, as can be other aspects of identity group difference.
Absolutely. I think you are speaking about identity group issues, and gender is one way of identifying a group, race, privilege, class, all of these things. How a particular culture responds to these issues, how they make them either relevant or not. How they assign different roles to different genders or generations or class or race is the question. And that's where it becomes cultural. So in Myanmar, we have a certain set of expectations around how genders interact with each other, which are probably very different from the expectations about how genders should react with each other in Sweden.
Like what? Example. Could you give an example?
Sweden is what we refer to as, from a cultural perspective, as an egalitarian culture, where the expectation is that women and men share equal role responsibilities throughout society, and how that plays out in terms of family relationships, interpersonal relationships, even business relationships, is going to define Sweden's orientation around the gender issue. In Myanmar, it's a much more hierarchically oriented culture where gender is a way of identifying differences in how people will relate with each other, so that the expectations of how men and women relate, again, interpersonally in terms of family relationships, the roles and responsibilities, and how they'll work with each other, if they work with each other at all, is going to be very different from that expectation in Sweden. So I think it becomes cultural when the culture has to decide how we're going to address gender or class or race. And that's where it becomes a cultural issue.
Yeah. So, getting into this topic of building common ground, how important is, well, first of all, I did want to ask you, how do you define cultural competence? Do you have a definition for that?
Yeah. Cultural competence is the ability to see how others see you, and to understand what you can do about accelerating the achievement of a common goal. So how do others see me? How am I being perceived? And do I know enough about them in order to find common ground between any differences that exist in these perceptions? And what's my ability to make that happen? How competent am I in making that happen?
So coming back to peace building initiatives and the role of culture in that. I don't know, your reflections on this topic?
It goes back to, I think, what we were saying at the very beginning. My experience as a kid growing up in a very multicultural environment was safe. And therefore I was able to, and that's probably based on a certain degree of privilege. I was able to see these differences, even though they were mystifying, even though they were different, even though I didn't understand them. I was able to approach them with a sense of curiosity, openness, and an expectation that it's going to be great. It's going to work out. We're going to have, ultimately, it's not going to affect my ability to understand my friend or build a relationship with them. And so that very positive, productive orientation that I was lucky enough to have, I guess, I see still as the fundamental task when working with people who are experiencing cultural differences, because it's not so automatic. Most of the time, I'm looking at people who are looking at differences fearfully, with a sense of dread, with a sense where the mystery is something that is a negative. If we're coming into a situation with individuals who are culturally different, and if there's a lot of hidden agenda, or I should say an unawareness of what my own true needs are, then culture becomes a reason why it won't work out. It becomes, the projection process occurs, where I project my fears and make it your fault that things aren't happening. And it's your fault because you're different from me.
Yeah.
But if we approach it positively, where we first understand what our true needs are, then we can and understand what the other's true needs are, then we can use the cultural differences that exist between us as ways to achieving those needs. And so I think it's about helping people at first figure out a little bit what they're about. Who am I? What do I want in this interaction? And then understand what the cultural differences are and use those cultural differences to actually help each other achieve the fundamental needs that we each bring to each other.
Yeah, I also, I know I've shared this with you in the past, that I also have such a view of group dynamics that if you, and it relates exactly to what you're saying, that if people feel safe, I might say if there's more collaboration in a group versus competition in a group, if there's collaboration in a group, well, let me say, if there's competition in a group, you will often see people get into what I call groupocentric behaviors, or they will break down by identity groups, because there's less trust in the room. And if the climate is shifted to one of collaboration, the cultural differences still exist, but they won't be such a source of polarization. I think they'll be more likely that people will be tolerant of them and look to understand them and appreciate them. Do you agree with that, or does that seem true to your experience?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And I've seen it happen. I'd like to see it happen more frequently than it does, because the reality of the practical experience that I have working with business teams around the world is that both sides are going into a meeting with very different agendas, and cultural differences simply become opportunities to blame the other for the reason why things aren't happening.
Yeah.
And if we can create a more collaborative environment where we are able to actually put real needs out there on the table, then the cultural differences don't become that much of a barrier. And if we can actually help both sides understand those cultural differences that are at the table and see them objectively for what they are, just different aspects of our human nature, then we can actually work with those differences and help them achieve the common ground that we're both looking for.
Yeah, Bob Staines, who's the last interview, was talking about, he's dealing with dialogue issues around very polarized issues, and talks about just how much I don't know if he uses the word front loading, but how much you really need to set things up, the climate up, before you even bring, because there's such an opportunity, so much of an inclination for people to misperceive, prejudge, see the other through those eyes of mistrust. And then you add all the cultural elements that you're talking about. And, I think that just gets so much exacerbated. So I'm wondering, with the global teams, do they give you an opportunity to really do some team building, team setting, climate building in the team, so those cultural issues will not become opportunities to blame, for instance?
To the degree that we can, that's precisely how we start. We want to help each side of the team, or each member in the team, reflect a little bit on what their concerns are, what their needs are, what kind of agenda are they bringing to the table, and what do they expect of the others, and really try to have a discussion around that and do some team building. Now, I say to the degree that we can, because we're always subject to the realities of the resources that we're given to do our work.
Right.
But I think it's an important first step.
So, Dean, words of wisdom, final words, reflections. You've been doing this work for a long time. Any words of wisdom, particularly for the younger listeners, this podcast, about culture, anything you want to say about it in terms of how its importance, and particularly its importance to the niche of this podcast, which is obviously building peace?
Yeah. We're not all becoming the same. Just because we have more opportunity to interact with each other, probably greater than ever before in human history. We have more cultural contact, probably greater than ever before in human history. There are more people moving across the face of the earth every day than ever before in human history. We have the opportunity through this increased cultural contact we have a choice. We can either see the differences that exist, and they do exist, and they are profound, and they are not going away, and see them as opportunities to view the world differently from the way we thought we should. We have the opportunity to find new solutions to old problems because of new ways of thinking that we can learn from other cultures. Or we can choose to see all these cultural differences that we're experiencing because of increased intercultural activity, or we can choose to see these as threats. And we can choose not to see the opportunity that exists, but to use the difference as a way of blaming the other for whatever failure we're experiencing or whatever difficulty we're experiencing. It's a choice. History tells us that increased intercultural contact, here's the bad news, right, does not tend to create understanding, peace, brotherhood, and kumbaya. It's not automatic just because we're increasing our contact with each other. In fact, historically, any kind of cultural contact initially created hostility, misunderstanding, and all sorts of catastrophe, until hopefully through some mechanism we learned enough about each other to finally find ways to work with each other. And that usually historically has been a very painful process. So the bad news is that intercultural contact does not create automatically the kind of peace building we're looking to do. In fact, initially it might create just the opposite. But therefore, the missing piece is the piece about understanding the culture, about understanding oneself as they interact with another culture, understanding how to remain authentic and yet anticipate what the other culture means so that we can build some common ground, so that I can still be myself but understand what you need so that we can find something together. This is a choice, and I think intercultural, we have the gift right now at this moment of being able to interact with other cultures and the gift of being able to learn about these differences and find ways to use these differences to accelerate common ground, to find ways to find where do we come together. This is a gift, a great opportunity.
It's also
technology allows it.
Yes, I find with myself, because I've had such a passion for understanding cultures other than my own, and I think it's always that it just gives me a closer view on what it means to be human, because it kind of gets me out of my own cultural conditioning and really seeing the bigger picture, which is such a gift, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it creates a sense of mystery and wonder, which I think has been the source of my energy in all the work that I've done. I just love the mystery and the wonder of it all.
Yeah. So, Dean, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and energy and all the work that you've been doing around the world. I hope you continue and keep it up. And thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you again on the Peacebuilding Podcast.
Thank you, Susan. It's been great to catch up with you. Thanks.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Our next episode is with the former British ambassador, Charles Crawford, who was the ambassador to Bosnia in the immediate post-Civil War reconstruction. Should be super interesting, so stay tuned for that, as well as my speech from Shanghai, and wish me luck.